I spent 7 years designing his real estate empire from the shadows, only to find him fastening the diamond necklace he promised me around the neck of his young assistant. They laughed at my naivety and threw me onto the street, believing I was nothing but an expired ornament. But they made a fatal mistake. The source code for their billion-dollar smart system is registered under my maiden name, and I am ready to hit delete. My name is Elena Vance, and at 29 years old, I foolishly believed that hard work and loyalty were the currencies that bought happiness. I walked through the glass doors of the Sterling Horizons headquarters in Seattle, my heart fluttering with a nervous excitement that I mistook for joy. It was our 7th wedding anniversary. In my arms, I clutched the heavy leather portfolio containing the final approved schematics for the Zenith, the smart tower that was destined to revolutionize the city skyline. I had spent sleepless nights over the last 2 years perfecting the biometric integration systems, ensuring that Julian, my husband, and the CEO would have a legacy that would outlast us both. The executive floor was silent, the administrative staff having left for the evening. I moved softly across the plush carpet, intending to surprise him. As I approached the heavy mahogany doors of his office, I heard a sound that stopped me dead in my tracks. It was a high-pitched, flirtatious giggle, followed by the deep, rumbling laughter of the man I had devoted my life to. The door was not fully latched. Through the narrow gap, the scene unfolded with a brutal clarity that seared itself into my retinas. Julian was leaning against his massive oak desk, holding a velvet box. He pulled out a sapphire necklace, the very same deep blue gem I had seen the receipt for weeks ago. The one I had convinced myself was my anniversary gift. But he did not turn toward the door to wait for me. Instead, he fastened it around the neck of Chloe, his 22-year-old assistant. "Oh, Julian," Chloe cooed, running her fingers over the stones. "It's heavy. Are you sure? Won't your boring old wife be expecting this?" I felt the air leave my lungs. Julian stepped back to admire the jewelry on her skin, his expression one of smug satisfaction. "Elena," he scoffed, waving his hand dismissively. "She wouldn't know true elegance if it hit her in the face. Besides, she is just a tool that has outlived its usefulness. The Zenith is ready for construction. I have her designs. I don't need her, nagging me about ethics and safety protocols anymore." My fingers lost all sensation. The portfolio slipped from my grasp and hit the marble floor with a thunderous crash. The noise echoed through the silent suite like a gunshot. Julian whipped his head around, his eyes widening for a fraction of a second before narrowing into a look of cold, unadulterated annoyance. There was no guilt, no panic, just irritation that he had been interrupted. Chloe merely smirked, leaning back against the desk as if she owned the place. I pushed the door open, my voice trembling so violently I could barely speak. "Julian, how could you? 7 years. I built this company from nothing with you." He adjusted his cufflinks, staring at me with eyes devoid of any warmth. "Save the tears. Elena, I am sick of your control. I am the CEO of Sterling Horizons, and you are just a liability I can no longer afford." He reached for the intercom on his desk. "Security, I have an intruder on the executive floor. Remove her immediately." "Intruder," I gasped, taking a step back. "I am your wife." "Not for long," he replied flatly. Before I could scream or fight, 2 uniformed guards appeared. Julian ordered them to drag me out, forbidding me from taking my purse or even the coat I had left in the reception area. I was hauled into the elevator and marched through the lobby like a common criminal. They shoved me out the revolving doors, and I stumbled onto the wet pavement. The Seattle rain was falling in freezing sheets, soaking through my thin blouse in a matter of seconds. I stood there, shivering uncontrollably, and looked up. The steel skeleton of the Zenith loomed above me, disappearing into the gray mist. I had poured my soul into that building. Every sensor, every line of code, every structural calculation was mine. Now, It felt like a monument to my own stupidity. A sleek black limousine pulled up to the curb, splashing water onto my shoes. The rear window rolled down slowly. Chloe sat inside, dry and warm, the sapphire necklace glinting around her neck. In her hand, she held my platinum wedding ring. Julian must have taken it from the safe this morning. Oops, she giggled, looking me in the eye with pure malice. She flicked her wrist, and the ring flew through the air. It landed with a dull splash in a puddle of dirty rainwater and motor oil at my feet. You look like a drowned rat, Chloe sneered. Julian says you're history. The window rolled up, and the car sped away into the gloom, leaving me standing alone in the rain with absolutely nothing but the clothes on my back and a heart that had just shattered into a million irreparable pieces. The legal assault began with terrifying efficiency at exactly 8 in the morning the following day. I was staying at a cheap airport hotel, having paid with the last bit of cash in my wallet, when a courier shoved a thick envelope into my chest. Julian's lawyers were not wasting time. The divorce papers cited irreconcilable differences, but the terms were a slaughter. They invoked every clause of the prenuptial agreement I had signed 7 years ago, back when I was young, stupid, and believed that discussing asset division was an insult to our eternal love. I reached for my phone to call our joint bank, but the screen flashed a notification that my service had been suspended. I rushed to the lobby and tried to use the landline to access my accounts. I am sorry. Mrs. Sterling, the automated voice droned. This account has been frozen due to pending litigation. I tried my credit cards. Declined. All of them. In the span of 12 hours, I had gone from the wife of a billionaire to a woman who could not afford a cup of coffee. But the financial strangulation was only the beginning. Julian wanted to destroy my name so thoroughly that I could never rise again. By noon, my phone, which I had managed to reconnect using the hotel Wi-Fi, began to flood with notifications from professional networks. But they were not messages of support. Julian had unleashed a whisper campaign through the tight-knit architecture community of Seattle. The rumor was precise and devastating. Elena Vance had been fired for corporate espionage and was suffering from a severe manic episode. I desperately called the partners at the firms we had collaborated with, people who had praised my vision for the Zenith just weeks ago. I cannot talk to you, Elena, one of my oldest mentors said, his voice clipped and cold. Julian told us about the stolen files. Please do not call here again. The line went dead. He had turned my allies into strangers. 2 days later, I was forced to attend a mediation session to retrieve my personal effects. I walked into the conference room, wearing the same clothes I had been thrown out in. Julian sat at the head of the table, flanked by 3 lawyers in suits that cost more than my parents made in a year. He looked immaculate, rested, and utterly bored. I want my designs, I said, my voice shaking with suppressed rage. The Zenith is my intellectual property. You can keep the money, but admit that I designed it. Julian laughed, a dry, humorless sound. He slid a folder across the polished mahogany table. Elena, honey, you are confused. You never designed anything. You were just a figurehead, a pretty face to soften the corporate image. My team did the work. I flipped open the folder. My breath hitched. The blueprints were there, but the digital signatures, the timestamps, the author metadata, everything had been altered. Where my name once stood, his initials were stamped in bold ink. He had been erasing me from the system for months, systematically transferring ownership of every line I drew while I was sleeping next to him. You monster, I whispered, gripping the edge of the table until my knuckles turned white. I spent nights bleeding over those drafts. And now you are trespassing, Julian replied, checking his watch. You have 1 hour to vacate the penthouse. Take your old junk. Anything bought with sterling money stays. I returned to the penthouse under the supervision of armed guards. I was not allowed to touch the jewelry, the designer clothes, or the art. I packed a single cardboard box with my old university sweatshirts and jeans. My eyes landed on my battered laptop from college, a silver brick I had kept for sentimental reasons. It was sitting on the bottom shelf of the closet, covered in dust. "Take that piece of trash," the guard sneered. I hugged the laptop to my chest. It was the only thing I had left. That night, I moved into a motel room on the outskirts of the city, near the industrial district. The contrast was a physical blow. The penthouse had been silent, smelling of white tea and orchids. This room smelled of stale tobacco and bleach. Every 45 minutes, a freight train roared past the window, shaking the thin walls and rattling the teeth in my head. I spent the next week applying to every small architecture firm within 50 miles. The result was always the same. "We checked your references," a hiring manager told me over the phone, her voice dripping with judgment. "Mr. Sterling's office mentioned your instability. We don't hire thieves." I had hit rock bottom. The rent for the motel was due, and I had $0 in my account. I looked at the only item of value I had managed to smuggle out in my pocket, a vintage watch my father had given me before he passed away. It was not worth much compared to the diamonds Julian bought Chloe, but it was my heart. I walked into a pawn shop under the gray, weeping sky. The broker looked at the watch and then at me with tired eyes. $200, he grunted. "It is worth at least 500, I pleaded, my voice cracking. "Please, I need to eat." 200, he repeated, already counting out the greasy bills. I took the money. As I walked back to the motel, listening to the train whistle scream in the distance, I realized the Elena Vance who designed skyscrapers was dead, but in the silence of that dirty room, something else was beginning to take shape in the dark. To keep myself from starving, I took the first job that did not ask for a background check. It was at a local nursery on the edge of town called Green Leaf. The work was grueling, a world away from the climate-controlled offices and ergonomic chairs I was used to. My hands, which had spent the last decade sketching delicate architectural lines and typing complex code, were now constantly stained with soil and covered in microcuts from rose thorns. My back ached with a dull, throbbing rhythm that became the soundtrack of my new life. Mrs. Higgins, the owner, was a woman carved from granite and oak. She was short, stout, and had a face weathered by 50 years of working outdoors. She did not care about the gossip columns or the rumors that I was a corporate spy. "You carry the bags, you trim the stems, you get paid," she had told me on the first day, handing me a pair of heavy shears. "I do not pay for drama, and I do not pay for tears." I kept my head down, finding a strange, numbing comfort in the physical labor. The rhythmic snipping of stems and the heavy scent of damp earth helped silence the noise in my head. But the silence was broken on a Tuesday afternoon when I saw the order form on the counter. It was a massive request for rare white orchids and blue hydrangeas. The delivery address was the Sterling Horizons headquarters. The client name was Chloe. My stomach turned over. They were ordering flowers for the grand unveiling of the Zenith. An hour later, a familiar silver convertible pulled into the gravel lot. Chloe stepped out, looking like a vision of manufactured perfection in a white silk dress that probably cost more than Mrs. Higgins made in a year. She was there to inspect the arrangement personally, her demands echoing through the quiet nursery. I tried to hide behind a stack of potting soil bags, hoisting a heavy sack onto my shoulder to move it to the back. But luck was not on my side. "Wait." Chloe's voice cut through the air. She walked over, her heels crunching on the gravel. She peered at me, her eyes widening with malicious delight. "Oh my God. Is that you, Elena?" I stood frozen, the heavy bag digging into my shoulder. I did not answer. "It is," she laughed, turning to the driver who was waiting by the car. "Look at this." The great architect, hauling dirt like a peasant. Julian was right. "You really have found your level. Leave me alone." "Chloe," I said quietly, trying to step past her. "Oops," she said, feigning a stumble. She tipped the bottle of mineral water she was holding. splashing the icy liquid all over the front of my shirt and into the bag of soil I was carrying. The mud instantly smeared across my chest and arms. "You look filthy," she sneered, wrinkling her nose. "Make sure you do not touch my flowers with those hands. We cannot have trash contaminating the launch." She turned on her heel and walked away, laughing as she got back into her car. I stood there, dripping wet, the cold water mixing with the heat of my humiliation. But as I watched her drive away, something inside me shifted. The sadness that had weighed me down for weeks evaporated, replaced by a cold, sharp clarity. It was the clarity of a structural engineer realizing exactly where to place the dynamite to bring a building down. That night, back in my noisy room, I did not sleep. I pulled out the old silver laptop I had saved. It was slow, the fan wheezing as it booted up, but it held the archives of my life before Julian. I began to dig. I ignored the photos of our wedding, the drafts of love letters, and went straight to the data. I searched for the original filings for the EcoSkin technology, the biological interface that allowed the zenith to breathe and regulate its own energy. Julian had claimed everything was his. He had doctored the recent files, but he had been lazy. He had forgotten the foundation. I found it at 3 a.m, a patent registration document from 5 years ago. My heart hammered against my ribs as I read the fine print. The core algorithm for the EcoSkin was not registered to Sterling Horizons. It was not registered to Julian Sterling. It was registered to Elena Vance. I had filed it 3 months before our wedding, under my maiden name, as part of my doctoral thesis. Because the technology was technically created before I signed the prenuptial agreement and before I was an employee of the company, it was premarital assets. And more importantly, I had never signed a transfer of intellectual property rights for this specific patent. I sat back in the creaky chair, the blue light of the screen illuminating a smile that felt foreign on my face. Julian had built a billion-dollar tower, a monument to his ego, wrapped in a skin that he did not own. Without my permission to use the EcoSkin software, the Zenith was nothing but a suffocating glass coffin. You forgot the foundation. Julian, I whispered to the empty room, my voice trembling not with fear, but with adrenaline, and I am about to pull it out. 2 days later, the bell above the nursery door chimed, announcing a customer who clearly did not belong in a place that smelled of manure and wet dirt. He was tall, wearing a charcoal suit that was tailored to within an inch of its life, and his shoes were polished to a mirror shine that reflected the fluorescent lights. He moved through the aisles of ferns and petunias with the confident, predatory grace of a shark swimming through a reef. He stopped in front of the rare orchid section, frowning at a delicate lady slipper orchid. "Can I help you find something?" I asked, wiping my hands on my apron. He did not look at me, his eyes still fixed on the flower. "I am looking for something resilient, something that can survive in a high-altitude winter garden with limited direct sunlight. My current landscape architect suggests hydrangeas, but I find them pedestrian." "Hydrangeas will die in that exposure," I said instinctively, the old architect in me taking over before I could stop myself. "If you have a north-facing winter garden, the structural integrity of the plants is less important than their transpiration rate. You do not need resilience. You need adaptability. I would suggest the Japanese kusa dogwood for structure, underplanted with hellebores. They thrive in shadow and bloom in winter." The man turned slowly. He had piercing gray eyes and a jawline that looked like it had been chiseled from granite. I recognized him immediately. It was Nolan Hayes, the CEO of Apex Group. He was Julian's only real rival, a man whose company had been brutally losing market share to Sterling Horizons over the last 3 years. He looked at my dirty apron, then at my face, his eyes narrowing in calculation. "You speak of structural integrity and transpiration rates," Nolan said, his voice smooth and low. "That is not the language of a florist." I took a deep breath. This was a gamble. It could destroy the little piece I had found, or it could be the match that lit the fuse. I am not a florist, I replied, meeting his gaze evenly. My name is Elena Vance, and I know exactly why your buildings are failing to compete with the Zenith. Nolan's expression did not change, but the air around him seemed to freeze. Vance, Sterling's wife, the one who had the mental break, the one who designed the Zenith, I corrected him sharply. And if you give me 10 minutes of your time, I can hand you the weapon to kill it. 3 hours later, I was sitting in the corner office of the Apex Group tower. The view was similar to Julian's, but the atmosphere was different, sharper, hungrier. I placed a printed copy of the patent registration on his glass desk. The Zenith relies on a system called EcoSkin, I explained, pointing to the highlighted text. It is a biological interface that regulates the building's temperature and air quality. Without it, the tower is just a glass oven. It will fail every safety inspection, and the operating costs will triple within 6 months. Nolan picked up the document, reading it in silence. He flipped the page, his eyes scanning the dates. This is registered to Elena Vance, he murmured, looking up at me. Not Sterling Horizons. Not Julian. He forgot to transfer the IP, I said, a cold smile touching my lips. He was too busy stealing my credit to realize he didn't legally own the work. Nolan leaned back, tapping his fingers on the arm of his chair. And you want to sell it to me, I can offer you $2 million right now, cash. I do not want your money, I said, my voice dropping to a whisper. I want him to hurt. I want him to stand on that stage and watch his empire crumble while the world laughs at him. Nolan stared at me for a long moment, and then a slow, dangerous smile spread across his face. I like you, Elena. You are not a victim. You are a shark in disguise. We struck a deal right there. Nolan would provide the legal team, the resources, and a salary that would get me out of that motel. In exchange, I would guide Apex in a hostile takeover of the market once Sterling fell. But the timing had to be perfect. We could not sue yet. We initiate Project Ghost, Nolan said, pouring 2 glasses of amber whiskey. We let him build it. We let him spend every dime of his investors' money. We wait until the concrete is dry and the ribbons are cut. And then I pull the plug. I finished, taking the glass he offered. From that day on, I ceased to be the flower girl. I began working out of a secure, windowless office on the 30th floor of Apex Group, under the pseudonym Ghost. I watched the news reports of Julian pouring billions into the final construction phase of the Zenith. Every dollar he spent was another nail in his coffin, and he was hammering them in himself, completely unaware that the woman he threw away was holding the sledgehammer. The engagement party was broadcast live on every major social media platform. I sat in the darkened strategy room at Apex Group, watching Julian and Chloe toast to their future with crystal flutes of vintage champagne. They were standing on the terrace of the unfinished Zenith Tower, surrounded by international investors who believed they were pouring money into the future of architecture. Chloe looked triumphant, but as a waiter brought out a massive arrangement of blood-red roses I had ordered anonymously. The camera caught a flicker of confusion on Julian's face. He pulled the card from the bouquet. I knew exactly what it said. The higher the foundation, the harder the fall. I saw his jaw tighten. He whispered something to Chloe, showing her the card. She laughed, tossed her hair back, and crumbled the note, dropping it carelessly over the railing. She thought it was a jealous prank. Julian, however, looked around the room with the eyes of a hunted animal. He knew that phrase. I used to say it to him whenever he tried to cut corners on safety regulations. The panic set in 48 hours later. Nolan slid a tablet across the desk to me. It displayed intercepted internal memos from the Sterling Horizons engineering team. They are trying to bring the EcoSkin online for the final systems test, Nolan said, leaning back in his chair with a satisfied smirk. It is not going well. It won't, I replied calmly. I wrote a backdoor into the source code 5 years ago. It is a failsafe, Unless a specific biometric key my retinal scan authorizes the startup, the system assumes it is being hacked and locks down the central processor. Julian had hired the best hackers money could buy. I watched the logs as they tried to brute force their way in. They were trying to bypass an encryption based on a biological algorithm I had modeled after the growth patterns of ivy. It was chaotic, organic, and impossible to predict if you did not know the seed sequence. To them, it looked like gibberish. To me, it was poetry. 3 days later, my phone rang. The number was blocked, but I knew who it was. I let it ring 4 times before answering. "Hello, Elena." Julian's voice came through, dripping with a sickeningly sweet tone that he used to reserve for wealthy widows he was trying to charm. "It has been a while. I was just thinking about you." "What do you want, Julian?" I asked, keeping my voice flat. "I feel bad, Elena. Truly. I think maybe things got a little heated during the separation. I want to make sure you are okay. Let's meet. Just 2 adults clearing the air." I agreed to meet him at a cheap, run-down diner in the industrial district, far away from his usual haunts. I arrived 10 minutes late, wearing jeans and a plain gray t-shirt, my hair tied back in a messy bun. I looked nothing like the polished corporate wife he remembered. Julian was sitting in a booth, looking out of place in his Italian silk suit. He was checking his phone nervously. When he saw me, he stood up, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Elena, you look rested." He lied. He ordered a coffee he didn't drink. I ordered nothing. "Look, let's cut to the chase," Julian said, leaning in. "I know you are struggling. I heard you are working at a flower shop. That is beneath you. I want to help." He slid a check across the sticky table. I glanced at it. $50,000. "Consider it a consulting fee," he said, his eyes darting around the room. "For the old times. I just need you to sign a release form regarding some old legacy files. Just a formality for the investors. You know how lawyers are." He was terrified. The Zenith was $1 billion paperweight without my code, and he was trying to buy the key for pennies. I looked at the check, then up at him. I smiled, a genuine, warm smile that seemed to unsettle him more than any scream could have. "You think $50,000 is fair?" I asked softly. "I can go to 75, he said quickly, sweat beading on his forehead. "Elena, please, don't be difficult." "You need this money." "I don't need anything from you, Julian," I said. "And as for the files, I am sure your brilliant team can figure it out. After all, you said I was just a figurehead, didn't you?" "Elena, wait, we can talk about this." His voice rose, cracking with desperation. "I can get you a job, I can." I stood up. I didn't take the check. I didn't say a word about the code. I simply turned and walked toward the door. The waitress dropped the bill for his coffee on the table as I passed. "Hey!" Julian called out. "Where are you going?" I paused at the door and looked back. "You have the bill, Julian. You always like to say you paid for everything. Well, start paying." I walked out into the cool afternoon air, leaving him sitting there with a check I wouldn't touch and a problem money couldn't solve. The game had just begun. It was exactly 48 hours before the grand gala when the first missile hit the glass fortress Julian had built. My legal team, a shark tank of aggressive litigators assembled by Nolan Hayes, served the papers directly to the Sterling Horizons executive suite. It was a cease and desist order, thick enough to be a weapon in itself, delivered by a process server who refused to leave until it was placed directly into Julian's hands. The language within those pages was not polite. It stated clearly and irrefutably that the intellectual property known as EcoSkin belonged exclusively to Elena Vance, and that any commercial use of said technology would result in immediate federal litigation and a total injunction against the opening of the tower. The stock market reacted instantly. Sterling shares dipped by 3% as rumors of the legal challenge leaked to the business blogs. But Julian, in his infinite arrogance, stood before his terrified board of directors, and laughed. I watched the internal video feed Nolan had accessed. Julian looked at the gray faces of his investors and waved his hand dismissively. "This is nothing but a desperate attempt at extortion from a bitter ex-wife." Julian scoffed, tossing the legal binder onto the table. "She is unstable. She wants attention. I will have this handled before the first bottle of champagne is poured." He did not understand that I was not looking for a settlement. I was looking for a surrender. Desperate to silence me before the press caught wind of the details, he made his first fatal error. He sent Chloe. She arrived at the Greenleaf Nursery just as the sun was setting, driving a nondescript rental car instead of her usual flashy convertible. She clutched a heavy metal briefcase to her chest, her knuckles white. She found me in the greenhouse, misting the ferns. She looked frantic, her makeup smudged, the arrogance she had displayed weeks ago replaced by a twitchy nervousness. "Take it!" she hissed, slamming the case onto the potting bench, nearly knocking over a tray of seedlings. $5 million. Cash. Julian drained the emergency liquidity fund for this. Just sign the waiver and disappear. She popped the latches. The case was filled with stacks of $100 bills. It was more money than I had ever seen in one place, enough to buy a new life anywhere in the world. But I didn't even look at the money. I looked up at the high-definition security camera I had installed above the entrance the day after my meeting with Nolan. The red light was blinking steadily. "You can tell Julian that my integrity is not for sale," I said, my voice steady and cold. "And Chloe, smile. You are on candid camera." She froze, her eyes darting up to the lens. Panic washed over her face. She slammed the case shut and ran, her heels skidding on the wet concrete. 10 minutes later, I uploaded 2 files to the internet. The first was the footage of the attempted bribe, titled "The Price of Silence." The second was an audio recording from our meeting at the diner, where Julian had explicitly said, "I know it is your design, but I am the one who sold it." The internet exploded, while the video of Chloe went viral, turning her into an instant pariah. Nolan Hayes held a press conference on the steps of the Apex Group tower. He stood in front of a wall of flashing cameras and dropped the hammer. He announced a strategic partnership with the mystery inventor of the EcoSkin technology, confirming that Apex Group had secured the exclusive rights to the only system that made sustainable skyscrapers possible. "We are proud to support the true architect behind the vision," Nolan told the reporters, "and we will defend her rights against theft." The narrative flipped instantly. The tabloids that had called me a gold digger were now running headlines asking, "Did Julian Sterling steal his empire?" The questions were no longer about my mental health. They were about Julian's fraud. By evening, the phones at Sterling Horizons were ringing off the hook. Major institutional investors were calling, threatening to pull their funding if the copyright issues were not resolved immediately. They did not want to be associated with a stolen product. I watched the fallout from my secure office. Julian was cornered. I saw the footage from inside his office. He was pacing like a caged tiger, his tie loosened, screaming at anyone who dared to enter. When Chloe tried to approach him, he turned on her with a viciousness that made me flinch even through the screen. "This is all your fault," he roared, pointing a trembling finger at her face. "You said you checked the legal filings. You said she was harmless? You stupid girl. You have ruined everything." He was unraveling, casting blame on the very mistress he had chosen over me, realizing too late that the expired ornament he had thrown away was actually the load-bearing wall holding up his entire life. The collapse of Julian's empire did not happen in a boardroom. It happened on a smartphone screen. Chloe, humiliated by Julian's screaming fit and terrified of the looming legal threats, sought validation in the only place she knew: social media. She went live on her stream late that evening, her eyes swollen from crying, a half-empty bottle of wine visible in the background. She was not thinking about non-disclosure agreements or corporate strategy. She was just a 22-year-old girl who wanted to hurt the man who had just called her stupid. I watched the view count on her stream climb from 3,000 to 50,000 in 10 minutes. He screamed at me. Chloe sobbed into the camera, wiping mascara from her cheek. He said I ruined his company. But it is not my fault. He is the fraud. He never drew any of those designs I watched him. I watched him trace her old work on the light table. He cannot even draw a straight line without a ruler. He is nothing but a liar. The clip was clipped, shared, and reposted millions of times before morning. The internet, ruthless and quick, dubbed him the Billboard CEO, all advertising, no structure. The illusion of the genius architect Julian Sterling had evaporated in 60 seconds of drunken confession. I decided it was time to twist the knife. From my terminal at Apex, I released the second wave of data. This was not just about the Zenith. This was about everything. I published the raw metadata files for the last 5 major projects Sterling Horizons had claimed credit for. Hidden deep within the digital layers of the blueprints were my cryptographic signatures, timestamps that predated Julian's creation dates by months. The reaction from the architectural community was swift and brutal. The American Institute of Architects issued a statement condemning plagiarism. Prominent designers who had once lauded Julian began tweeting their support for me, distancing themselves from the radioactive fallout of Sterling Horizons. Then came the death blow. The lead financing bank for the Zenith project invoked the reputational risk clause in their lending contract. They froze the credit line. Without that capital, construction stopped immediately. Julian tried to salvage the situation with an emergency press conference on the steps of the unfinished tower. It was a disaster. He looked haggard, his usually perfect hair disheveled. "These are malicious lies," Julian stammered into the microphones, sweating under the glare of the flashbulbs. "I am the visionary here. My wife was merely an assistant who—" "Mr. Sterling," a reporter from the Seattle Times shouted, cutting him off. "Is it true that you cannot use the building's operating system without your ex-wife's permission? Is the Zenith effectively a dead building?" Julian turned pale and stormed off the podium without answering, his security team shoving cameras aside. That night, the rain in Seattle was relentless. I was sitting in my motel room, listening to the freight trains, when a violent pounding shook the flimsy door. It was 2 a.m. Elena Julian's voice came through the wood, distorted by the wind and his own hysteria. "Elena, open this door. I know you are in there." I stood up but did not move toward the lock. I walked to the window and peered through the blinds. Julian was standing in the mud, soaked to the bone. He looked like a ghost of the man who had thrown me out just weeks ago. His eyes were wild, red-rimmed, and desperate. "Elena, please," he sobbed, leaning his forehead against the doorframe. "I will give you anything. Half the company. All of it. Just turn the code back on. They are going to ruin me. I have nothing left. You have to help me. You are my wife. I am not your wife." I whispered to the empty room. "I am your consequences." I did not open the door. I did not offer him a towel or a kind word. Instead, I picked up my phone and dialed 3 digits. 911. "What is your emergency?" "There is a man trying to break into my room," I said calmly. "I fear for my safety. He is aggressive and refusing to leave." 10 minutes later, the blue and red lights of the police cruisers cut through the darkness. I watched from the window as 2 officers grabbed Julian. He struggled, screaming my name, begging me to come out and save him. They spun him around and slammed him against the hood of the patrol car. "Elena, do not do this," he shrieked as the handcuffs clicked shut around his wrists. "I am Julian Sterling. You cannot arrest me." "You have the right to remain silent," the officer recited, pushing his head down to guide him into the back seat. The next morning, the photo of Julian Sterling wet, crying, and handcuffed in the mud outside a cheap motel was on the front page of every newspaper in the country. The caption did not call him a visionary. It simply read, "The Collapse." The emergency board meeting called by the directors of Sterling Horizons was less of a corporate gathering and more of an execution. The stock price had plummeted by 60% in 3 days, and the banks were circling like vultures. Through my legal team, I delivered a single non-negotiable ultimatum. I would grant the company a license to use the EcoSkin technology, saving the Zenith project from becoming a billion-dollar ruin, but only on one condition. Julian Sterling had to be terminated for cause immediately, and his equity in the company had to be stripped to cover the damages from the lawsuits. While the board was busy shredding Julian's contract, Nolan Hayes and I were executing the second phase of our plan. With the stock price in freefall, we began buying. We bought every share that panicked investors were dumping. By the time the market closed on Friday, the Apex Vance partnership controlled a controlling interest in Sterling Horizons. We did not just defeat the enemy, we bought his house while he was still sleeping in it. The cleansing did not stop with Julian. The internal audit I suggested revealed that Chloe had not just been sleeping her way to the top, she had been stealing. The forensic accountants found unauthorized transfers totaling nearly $200,000 used to purchase designer handbags, shoes, and that silver convertible she loved so much. When the police arrived to escort her out, it was not for a simple dismissal. She was charged with grand larceny and embezzlement. She left the building in handcuffs, screaming that Julian had told her it was okay, but nobody was listening. On Monday morning, I returned to the headquarters of Sterling Horizons. I did not enter through the service entrance. I walked through the main revolving doors, wearing a tailored black suit that cost more than my first car. The atmosphere in the lobby was suffocating. The same receptionist who had smirked when the guards dragged me out now turned pale, quickly lowering her gaze to her desk. As I walked toward the elevators, the sea of employees parted. There were no whispers, no giggles. There was only a heavy, terrified silence. The people who had mocked me, who had called me Julian's boring accessory, now looked at me with a mixture of awe and fear. They knew that with a single keystroke, I could fire them all. I took the private elevator to the top floor. The security guard standing outside the CEO's office was new. He nodded respectfully and opened the heavy mahogany doors for me. The office was a mess of cardboard boxes. Julian was standing by the window, packing a framed photo of himself. He looked 10 years older than he had a month ago. His shirt was wrinkled, and the arrogance that had defined him was completely gone, replaced by a hollow, shaking exhaustion. 2 security officers stood in the corner, watching him to ensure he did not steal any company property, a humiliating reversal of how he had treated me. He heard the click of my heels and turned around. When he saw me, his shoulders slumped. "Elena," he croaked, his voice cracking. I didn't think you would come. Are you here to—" Gloat. I did not answer him immediately. I walked over to the massive desk, the one where I had caught him fastening the necklace around Chloe's neck. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small object. It was my platinum wedding band. I had spent hours searching the muddy drainage ditch outside the building to find it, and I had boiled it to remove every trace of dirt. I placed the ring on the desk. It made a sharp, metallic sound against the wood. "I found this in the mud where your mistress threw it," I said, my voice devoid of any emotion. "I cleaned it. You should take it." Julian stared at the ring, his hands trembling as he reached out but stopped short of touching it. "Elena, I am so sorry. I can fix this. We can—" "No, Julian." I cut him off. "You cannot fix anything. You are done." I pushed the ring closer to him. "Take it," I said coldly. "This thing is cheap, just like your character." Julian flinched as if I had struck him physically. He collapsed into his leather chair, burying his face in his hands. A sob escaped his throat, a raw sound of total defeat. He looked around the room, realizing that the art on the walls, the view of the city, the money, and the reputation were all gone. And worst of all, he realized that the woman standing in front of him, the one he had called useless, was the only reason he had ever been a king. "Security," I said, turning my back on him. Escort Mr. Sterling out of my building. He is trespassing." The grand opening of the Zenith was no longer just a corporate event. It was the coronation of a new era. The banners that draped the towering glass facade did not bear the Sterling name alone anymore. They read Apex Vance, written in gold letters that shimmered under the floodlights. I stood backstage, smoothing the fabric of my midnight blue silk gown. It was the color of the deep ocean, a stark contrast to the drab gray uniform of the flower shop I had worn just weeks ago. When the announcer called my name, I walked out onto the stage to the applause of 2,000 people. The flashbulbs were blinding, a sea of white light that pulsed like a heartbeat. I stood at the podium, looking out at the faces of the city's elite, the investors, the politicians, and the architects who had once turned their backs on me. "Ladies and gentlemen," I began, my voice amplified clearly across the silent hall. "For years, we believed that a building was just a shelter, but tonight, I present to you the EcoSkin, a living, breathing interface that does not just house life, but protects it." As I spoke, explaining the complex biological algorithms that controlled the tower's climate, a different drama was unfolding beneath our feet. Julian had not accepted his exile. Banned from the premises and stripped of his credentials, he had snuck into the service tunnels wearing a stolen maintenance uniform. He looked like a shadow of his former self, gaunt and unshaven, his eyes wild with a manic need for destruction. His plan was simple and desperate. He wanted to cut the main power lines in the sub-basement, plunging the gala into darkness and humiliating me one last time. But he had forgotten who designed the security protocols. As he approached the main breaker panel, knife in hand, the sensors I had embedded in the walls identified his heartbeat and his gait. The system did not sound an alarm. Instead, it quietly engaged the containment protocol. The heavy steel doors of the server room slammed shut, sealing him inside a soundproof glass box. On stage, I pressed a button on my remote to demonstrate the security features. I expected to show a simulation of a firewall blocking a hacker. Instead, the massive screen behind me flickered and cut to a live feed from the sub-basement. A collective gasp ripped through the audience. Projected 40 feet high was Julian Sterling, screaming silently, hammering his fists against the reinforced glass. He looked like a trapped insect, his face twisted in ugly, impotent rage. He was kicking the door, spitting, and pulling at his hair. It was a raw, unfiltered display of a man who had lost his mind. The crowd murmured in confusion, thinking it was a hyper-realistic actor playing the part of an intruder. "Is that—" Julian, someone in the front row, whispered loudly. I turned to look at the screen, feigning mild surprise, though a cold satisfaction warmed my chest. I turned back to the microphone, my expression perfectly serene. "As you can see," I said, my voice smooth as velvet, "the EcoSkin system is highly intuitive. It not only filters out 99% of air pollution, but it also identifies and filters out toxic elements." The realization hit the room like a physical wave. Laughter began to ripple through the crowd, starting as nervous chuckles and swelling into a roar of applause. They realized the irony. The man who had tried to throw me out was now trapped by the very building he claimed to own. Security guards swarmed the server room on the screen. The cameras continued to roll as they dragged Julian out. He was kicking and screaming, shouting obscenities that were mercifully muted by the soundproof glass. They hauled him through the service corridor and out into the waiting glare of the paparazzi outside, ending his career not with a bang, but with a public temper tantrum. Nolan Hayes stepped up to the podium, placing a hand on my shoulder. He waited for the applause to die down. "Tonight, we do not just celebrate a building," Nolan announced, his voice booming. "We celebrate the genius who breathed life into it. It is my honor to announce that Elena Vance has agreed to lead our future, effective immediately. She is the new Chief Executive Officer of the Sustainable Development Division for the Apex Vance Alliance." The ovation was deafening. I stood there, bathed in the light, watching the empty space on the screen where Julian had been. He was gone, erased from the narrative, and for the first time in 7 years, I was the only one writing the story. 1 week after the gala, I stood in the center of the penthouse that used to be my prison. I had bought it back that morning at a foreclosure auction for half of what it was worth. The air still smelled faintly of Julian's expensive cologne and the lies he had told within these walls. I did not keep it that way. By noon, a demolition crew had arrived. I watched with a grim satisfaction as they took sledgehammers to the Italian marble floors Julian had insisted on and tore down the velvet drapes that had blocked out the sun. I was stripping the space down to the studs, erasing his footprint so I could build something that finally felt like home. The news cycle had moved on, but the consequences for those who had wronged me were permanent. Chloe avoided jail time, but the judge was not lenient. She was sentenced to 500 hours of community service. Yesterday, I drove past the city park and saw her. She was wearing a bright orange safety vest, stabbing at discarded soda cans with a trash picker. She looked up as my car passed, her face devoid of the makeup she used to hide behind. And for the first time, she looked small. I did not stop. I did not roll down the window. She was no longer my problem. Julian fared far worse. His reputation was so toxic that he could not even get a meeting with a loan shark, let alone a bank. He filed for personal bankruptcy on Tuesday. The last I heard, he was living in a studio apartment in the bad part of town, surviving on unemployment checks. The business community had exiled him completely. He was a pariah, a man who had flown too close to the sun on wings made of stolen wax, and now he was drowning in the ocean of his own making. But revenge was only half of the journey. The other half was gratitude. I drove out to the edge of town, back to the Greenleaf Nursery. The smell of damp earth was welcoming this time. Mrs. Higgins was there, repotting a fern. I handed her an envelope. Inside was a cashier's check for $200,000, enough to fix the greenhouse roof and expand her business like she had always dreamed. "You did not have to do this," she said, her gruff voice softening as she held the check. "You gave me a job when I was nothing but a liability," I told her. "Consider this, an investment in resilience." That evening, I stood on the observation deck of the Zenith. The city of Seattle spread out below me, a grid of golden lights shimmering in the twilight. The wind whipped at my hair, but I felt anchored. I was standing on my own design, breathing air filtered by my own code. Nolan walked up beside me, holding 2 glasses of sparkling water. He respected my boundaries enough not to bring champagne. "It is a beautiful view," he said, leaning against the railing. "You know, Elena, the board is asking about the Phase 2 expansion, but I was thinking, maybe we could discuss it over dinner. Not a business meeting, just dinner." He looked at me, and his eyes held a question that went deeper than architecture. He was offering a partnership, perhaps something more, but this time it was based on respect. He saw me as an equal, not an accessory. I took a sip of the water and smiled, but I did not say yes immediately. I looked out at the horizon. For the first time in my life, I did not need a man to define my worth. I did not need Julian's money or Nolan's protection. I had my own name. "Ask me again in a month, Nolan," I said softly. "Right now, I am just enjoying the view from the top." I went back to my desk, the massive glass surface reflecting the city lights. I pulled over the blueprints for the next project, a floating garden complex. I picked up my pen and signed the bottom corner. I did not write Mrs. Sterling. I wrote, in bold, sweeping black ink, Elena Vance, Chief Architect. I capped the pen, turned off the office lights, and walked out of the room. The door clicked shut behind me, sealing the past in the dark as I stepped into the bright, unwritten future. Thank you so much for listening to my story. Please comment down below where you are listening from. I would love to hear your thoughts and connect with you all. Don't forget to subscribe to Lily Revenge Stories, like this video, and hit that like button so this story can be heard by even more people.